In the early decades of the 19th century, the landscape of New England was undergoing significant change, shaped by rapid industrial expansion. That let's step back into that era and uncover a case that arose from the transforming mill towns in the northeastern states of America, where new factories, strict religious communities, and shifting social expectations shaped the daily lives of thousands of working people. Sarah Maria Cornell, a woman about 30 years of age, had come from the rural township of Robert Inn, Vermont, before entering the mill districts of New England. At the time, the broader region was undergoing a steady shift from scattered agricultural settlements toward the expanding textile centers of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. These developing districts were marked by long factory hours, crowded boarding houses, and a heavy dependence upon young, unmarried women who formed a considerable portion of the early manufacturing labor force. However, the 1830s were also years of hardship across much of New England, marked by economic insecurity, moral scrutiny, and the influence of churches whose discipline extended deeply into social and personal conduct. Opportunities for security or advancement were scarce, especially for single women whose livelihood depended on the constant availability of factory employment and the approval of the religious communities around them. Sarah Maria Cornell was placed in the care of relatives during her childhood after her father left the household, and her mother, unable to provide for the family, arranged for her daughter to leave elsewhere in the rural districts of early 19th century Vermont and Connecticut. Such arrangements were not uncommon, and they often resulted in young girls entering domestic service or learning manual trades at an early age. By the age of 12, she had been set to learning sewing work, and soon afterwards, she began moving between several mill towns where her labor was required. Factory records and local reports place her at Killingly, North Providence, Slaterville, and Jute City, usually for short periods, as positions in these establishments were frequently lost through allegations of minor theft or improper conduct. Each dismissal required her to leave her lodging and travel again to another district in search of employment. Her attempts to join Methodist societies in these communities were similarly unsettled. Although she attended meetings and sought membership, disputes concerning her behavior resulted in her removal from more than one congregation. The mill towns of this period, where boarding house life was crowded and social oversight was strict, such expulsions reduced the limited forms of support available to single women who depended upon both steady work and communal acceptance. It was during her residence in Lell in the year 1829 that she came into contact with the Methodist minister, the Reverend Ephraim Kingsbury Avery, who was then stationed in that town. When the internal inquiries of the Methodist Society were convened in the autumn of 1830, her name appeared in the proceedings. She was accused of taking muslin from a mill and of improper association with young men, and the committee, of which Reverend Avery was a member, recorded a decision removing her from the fellowship. The formal entries of the meeting and the testimony of those present indicated that she was required to withdraw from the congregation immediately after the ruling. Shortly afterwards, she traveled to Somersworth in New Hampshire, where she sought admission to a Methodist gathering known as a love feast. The leaders there declined her request, and a report was circulated that she expressed strong resentment toward Reverend Avery, whom she believed Tohavi played a central role in her earlier dismissal. The months that followed were marked by further movement across the mill districts of New England. After leaving Somersworth, Sarah Maria Cornell traveled first to Waltham and then to Taunton, taking short-term employment in each place before removing once more to in the spring of 1832. She was recorded as staying in Woodstock, Connecticut, where she worked in the household of her sister's husband, Jindal Ross, and by the close of that summer, she had proceeded again to Massachusetts, arriving at Fall River and obtaining a position at the Anawan Mill. She lodged at the house of the Hathaway family on Spring Street, a boarding arrangement typical of mill operatives in the town. During this period, letters were exchanged between her and the Reverend Avery. These communications were preserved and later produced, and they showed that on the 19th of October, she met him in Fall River, where she stated that he was the father of the child she was carrying. He'd need the allegation, but the correspondence continued thereafter, when unmarried women employed in the mills were found to be expecting a child. Comments within the boarding houses and among the operatives often followed quickly. During the first weeks of December, several of the women at the Hathaway lodging were heard remarking upon the changes in Sarah Maria Cornell's appearance, noting that she had altered her clothing to looser garments and had begun arranging her shawl in a manner that concealed her figure. That on more than one occasion, as she returned from her shift at the Anawan Mill, 2 or 3 operatives standing by the doorway lowered their voices while observing her pass, and one was heard stating that a woman in her condition would not be kept long in any mill in the late afternoon at about 5:00, when the boarders in the Howery lodging gathered near the communal kitchen to prepare their supper and speak of the occurrences at the mill. Sarah Maria Cornell remained in her chamber for extended periods, where she sorted through her small store of letters laid out upon her bed. The box containing her papers was opened and closed several times. On the 20th of December, and she was seen folding certain sheets carefully before placing them inside. Among these papers was a newly written note that she dated that day, directing that inquiries should be made of the Reverend Ephraim Avery of Bristol, in the event that her whereabouts became uncertain. Within her chamber, Sarah Maria Cornell made the ordinary adjustments to her clothing and placed her cloak and bonnet together in readiness. Shortly after dusk, she stepped from the room, passed through the lower passage off the house, and left the lodging unaccompanied. No destination was mentioned, and she carried no more than a small handkerchief containing her personal effects. The women in the house recorded only that she went out alone into the December night. At this time, the Reverend Ephraim Avery was known to be at Bristol, several miles away, a fact established by his routine ministerial duties in that town. The farm of Mr. John Derry, situated on the Tibetan side of the river, lay between Fall River and Bristol, and could be reached by the road that extended beyond the outskirts of the mill village. On the morning of the 21st of December, shortly after 9 o'clock, Mr. John Derry, a farmer whose property lay in the Tibetan side of the river, walked toward a haystack near the boundary of his land. He had set out to examine the condition of the fencing and the stored fodder, as was his usual practice during the winter months. As he approached the stack, he noticed a dark shape against one of the posts of the enclosure. Moving closer, he observed that it was the figure of a woman suspended by a length of rope fixed around the top rail. Derry immediately called to a neighbor who came across the field and climbed the fence to reach the spot. Together, they observed that the woman did not respond to their attempts to use her. The rope was fixed firmly to the post, and the surrounding grass bore the marks of frost. The 2 men then went at once to inform the nearest authorities of what they had found. Once After Derry had conveyed what he had seen to the nearest residence, a messenger was sent into Fall River, and word reached those connected with the Hathaway lodging. They notified the town authorities, who immediately dispatched assistance to the Tiverton farm. When the officers arrived, they instructed that the body remain untouched until a medical examination could be conducted, and Dr. Thomas Wilbur was requested to attend without delay. He examined the remains at the location and confirmed that the deceased was the woman identified earlier as Sarah Maria Cornell. The authorities then directed that the body be conveyed to Fall River for a formal inquiry. Meanwhile, information began to circulate among the residents about the note found in her box, naming the Reverend Ephraim Kingsbury Avery of Bristol as a person to be consulted should she be missing. In consequence of this reference, inquiries were made at Bristol, and the movements of Reverend Avery on the preceding days were examined. Initial depositions gathered from both towns produced differing impressions, prompting 2 separate inquests, the first at Tiverton and the second at Bristol. The Tifton inquest convened promptly after the removal of the body. Several witnesses from the farm and from Fall River gave evidence concerning the position in which the remains were found, the clothing of the deceased, and the note that had been discovered at her lodging. Dr. Wilbur presented his observations, including the presence of marks upon the neck and indications of advanced pregnancy. After reviewing the available papers and circumstances, the jury returned a finding of death by her own act, with R. Mark referring to the wicked conductive, a married man, as having contributed to her distress. Shortly afterward, a separate inquest convened at Bristol, where additional testimony was heard concerning the Reverend Avery's acquaintance with the deceased. Witnesses described the meeting in Fall River on the 19th of October, the letters that had passed between them, and the assertions made by the deceased regarding the paternity of her expected child. In this second proceeding, the jury considered the evidence sufficient to justify the suspicion that the death had not been the result of her own hand. As public interest increased, officers sought to locate Reverend Avery. Upon learning that an attachment had been issued, he left Bristol and traveled northward. He was found in the township of Ring, New Hampshire, having altered his appearance with a grown beard and tinted spectacles. Sheriff Harvey Honden apprehended him there on the 20th of January and conveyed him under guard to Newport, Rhode Island, where he was committed for trial. The arrest drew considerable attention, and the sheriff's prompt action was widely noted in the reports of the time that by early spring, the matter advanced to the grand jury sitting at Newport, that on the 8th of March, they returned a bill charging Reverend Avery with murder in the first degree. He pleaded not guilty. During the intervening weeks, newspapers throughout the region published detailed accounts of the circumstances, and public sentiment became sharply divided. Several journals connected with the Methodist societies defended Reverend Avery's character and questioned the credibility of the deceased, while other papers, including those in Providence and New York, printed extensive articles setting out the evidence that had emerged. The trial commenced at Newport on the 16th of May, 1833, before a large assembly. The proceedings extended over 27 days, during which 196 witnesses were examined. The court admitted the testimony heard at both inquests, including that of Mr. Derry, who described the discovery of the body, Dr. Wilbur, who detailed the condition of the remains, and several boarders from the Hathaway house, who accounted for the letters and the note found among her papers. Evidence concerning the deceased's pregnancy was also presented, as well as differing medical opinions regarding the time at which the child might have been conceived. Members of the church connected with Reverend Avery spoke to his whereabouts in the evening of the 20th of December. They stated that he had been on Aquidneck Island taking exercise and returning to his residence at Bristol by 9:00. The defense called numerous witnesses to confirm his presence there and to describe his conduct as that of a man engaged in his ordinary duties. They further introduced records relating to the deceased's past employments, including allegations of theft, prior expulsions from Methodist congregations, and earlier threats of self-injury, which they argued bore upon her reliability and the plausibility of self-destruction. Throughout the proceedings, Reverend Avery remained silent, as was permitted by law in Rhode Island, and he did not call any additional witnesses beyond those already named by his counsel. The prosecution relied chiefly on the note left by the deceased, the continued correspondence between the two, the marks observed upon the neck, and the unexplained circumstances under which she had left the lodging on the night preceding her death. They contended that the meeting between the parties suggested by the letters off colored paper formed the essential link in the chain of events. When the arguments had concluded, the jury retired and deliberated for 16 hours. On the 2nd of June, they returned into court and pronounced a verdict of not guilty. Upon hearing the decision, the court ordered that the prisoner be discharged. Thus, By the close of 1833, the legal proceedings had reached their final outcome. The Reverend Ephraim Kingsbury Avery was acquitted of the charge brought against him during the previous Christmas season. Shortly after first inquiries, a steamboat had carried a large company of men from Fall River to Bristol. Upon landing, they proceeded directly to the residence of the Reverend Avery and surrounded the property. Several men struck the gate and called for him to come out, demanding information regarding his movements on the night of the 20th of December. The windows had been fastened from within, and voices from inside stated that the Reverend would not appear. The disturbance brought local constables to the scene, and additional officers arrived as the crowd pressed against the boundary of the property. The constables formed a line before the house and instructed the gathering to disperse, warning that the road would be cleared if the order were not obeyed. After repeated commands, the officers moved steadily among the men, directing them toward the quay and along the joining streets. Under the supervision, the crowd withdrew, and the steamboat later conveyed many of them back to Fall River. The incident was reported widely and became a central example of the divisions that deepened after the trial that in the months following the acquit, isolated effigies resembling the Reverend were discovered in remote parts of the countryside, suspended from trees or from the posts of farm fences. These displays were noted in contemporary accounts and were regarded as signs that resentment associated with the case had not diminished at the same time. New reports began to appear in several newspapers concerning aspects of the proceedings not fully explored in court. Some journals questioned the early conduct of the Methodist authorities, observing that considerable effort had been made to defend the Reverend's reputation and to emphasize past allegations against the deceased. Editors also drew renewed attention to the note found among her papers, pointing out the specificity of the reference to the Reverend should any inquiry arise about her whereabouts. The colored letters were cited as further grounds for examining whether arrangements of a private nature had been made on the night preceding her death. In response to these appeals, certain local committees undertook to review such papers as were publicly available. They compiled extracts from the testimony given at both inquests, compared the medical statements, and arranged the correspondence in chronological order. Their observations were published in brief pamphlets and inserted into the columns of several journals that those involved did. Their findings were published in modern studies of the matter, but as they emerged long after original proceedings had ended, they had no bearing upon the legal outcome and could not alter the judgment rendered in 1833. Following the refusal of the authorities to reopen the matter, the official position remained unchanged. They concluded that no special circumstances existed to warrant further examination of the case, and determined that the verdict delivered at Newport in 1833 stood as the final legal judgment. The proceedings were therefore regarded as complete, and no additional action was taken by the civil or ecclesiastical bodies involved. After the close of the trial, the Reverend Ephraim Kingsbury Avery withdrew from his ministerial duties. Contemporary reports recorded that Helliff, the districts in which the case had arisen and resided for periods in Connecticut, New York, and Ohio, engaging chiefly in agricultural pursuits. The deceased Sarah Cornell was later removed from her original place, off burial and interred at Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, where her name continued to be associated with the disputes that had followed the trial. The case itself entered the record of early 19th century inquiries as one that remained the subject of disagreement among those who studied its proceedings. Subsequent writings noted the divisions that arose between civic opinion, religious societies, and the press, and the surviving correspondence and inquest papers continued to be examined by later generations. Editors also drew renewed attention to the note found among her papers, pointing out the specificity of the reference to the Reverend should any inquiry arise about her whereabouts. The colored letters were cited as further grounds for examining whether arrangements of a private nature had been made on the night preceding her death. In response to these appeals, certain local committees undertook to review such papers as were publicly available. They compiled extracts from the testimony given at both inquests, compared the medical statements, and arranged the correspondence in chronological order. Their observations were published in brief pamphlets and inserted into the columns of several journals that those involved did. Their findings were published in Modern Studies of the Matter,